And so we would never have had a Kyle Rittenhouse situation. We would never have had a Jay Bishop situation. We'd not have any of this if Democrat mayors and governors simply implemented and fulfilled their law-keeping responsibilities. They deliberately abdicated them. There is no spinning their way out of that one.
I'm Dr. Duke with The New American. Really happy to be joined by Dr. Steve Turley, who has a remarkable internet presence. He's a remarkable speaker and writer. We have some videos of his recent work over at The New American. And Steve, thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Duke. Thank you so much for having me.
Tell people where they can find your stuff if they want to learn more about you and what you do.
My treasure trove. Yes, it's found at turleytalks.com. It's my last name, Turley. Talks like TEDtalks.com. Or if they like YouTube, they can just punch in Dr. Steve Turley and see all our videos there. We do 2 videos a day analyzing current events and a lot of conservative trends so we can all live in the present in light of even better things to come. And we just surpassed over 500,000 subscribers, so it's really exciting.
Fantastic. That's great news, especially with YouTube cracking down. That's nice that you're going the right direction. I read recently one of your pieces on what's going on in Portland, how this conservative patriot has lost his life. Not only do you have goons, Antifa goons, celebrating this in the streets, you now have the mayor of Portland, just the reprehensible Mayor Wheeler, who has figured out pretty much what Joe Biden has figured out, that you can't ignore it, you can't pretend it's peaceful protests anymore. You're going to have to call it out, but they're calling it out and blaming it all, predictably, on Donald Trump. Give us your take on the situation.
Yeah, it is certainly escalated. There's no question. I'd say in my video, and I do have an article on it as well, that I think we may have crossed a line where the hostility now can't be rolled back. In order to have a democratic society of some kind, you have to have what's called the communication model. And the communication model is this notion that even though we're maybe different ideologies or different races or different cultures, we can still communicate intelligibly with one another. We're all human. It's rooted in the Christian tradition of the image of God. We all share in common certain frames of reference that speak to our humanity. And that way you can have a polyethnic society that can come together and work out things, in our case, constitutionally and so on. We're moving into a period now where that's being questioned like never before. And ironically, it's being questioned on the Democratic Party. And I think people like Ted Wheeler and Jenny Durkin over in Seattle and the soy boy Fry in Minneapolis and even de Blasio in New York, they are feeling an extraordinary pressure. If you notice, they're all part of the old white bourgeois liberal class. But a new left is rising up, and it's a very ethno-nationalist. It's a very tribalistic, mono-ethnic left that in many respects resembles what we would normally call the alt-right. It's a nationalist absolutism based upon one's race. And if we're different races and different cultures, then we can't communicate with each other. So the communication model breaks down. That's why we're seeing the death of democratic procedures, I think, and rhetoric in the left. And so what I think these big city mayors are doing is they are doing their best to stave off what seems to be an inevitable civil war within the left, a civil war between the new left, the Antifa BLM left, the radical Marxist left, versus the old bourgeois globalist left. And the way they're trying to do it is to pass off the buck to Trump and the Republicans and try to ignite a different civil war, a civil war between the radical left and the growing, very vibrant patriot movement that's going all across the country that has law enforcement backing them. So we're seeing a very fascinating coalition going on, particularly in Portland. We're seeing it in Kenosha. We've seen it in Seattle, where law enforcement officials are actually forming informal alliances, if not full out joining armed militias to protect suburbs and exurbs from this urban insanity, this urban riot mentality. And so I think what you're seeing here is an absolute mess. That in many ways is the collapse of the left because they're going through their own civil war. And I think they're trying to turn this more and more into a broader civil war so as to deflect from their own failures and inadequacies.
Yeah, the model you just mentioned, you can see it in the Democrat top tier politicians. It's interesting to me that the American people definitively during the primaries rejected Bernie Sanders. I'm talking about Democrat voters, and chose Joe Biden, misguidedly thinking that he was somehow more of a moderate. Now that we know that Joe Biden's entire platform is Bernie's platform plus a little bit more to the left, it's amazing to me that there's not a defection away from Biden. Maybe there will be by election day, but if the Democrat voters who rejected Bernie are getting now Bernie on steroids, you would think that they would see that, right? And it doesn't seem like, at least initially, that they all seem to be taking the party line that, well, he's still better than Donald Trump, right? That's part of the problem, I think. And what you said, the other thing is really important that we should follow up on, is with all of these fraction lines in the Democrat Party, it seems to me the old-time liberal globalists that you mentioned are siding with, basically giving free rein to the radical left wing. The only way they think they can survive is not to move back the other way and support moderate conservatives, people who want to see borders and free speech. Why are they going full left this way?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that one, because you're absolutely right, because that's certainly what the moderate center right neocons did with Trump. They just went and joined with the Democrats, the never Trumpers, as it were. But you're not seeing sort of the never AOCs as much, right? We are, interestingly enough, we may be seeing a movement like that based on the latest Emerson poll with Black voters, which is really fascinating. Leo Terrell on the Sean Hannity show just the other night, he's predicting that Trump is going to get the biggest share of Black votes for any modern Republican candidate that we've ever seen. Already we're seeing 19%, according to the Emerson poll, saying they're going to vote for Trump, which is astonishing. Well, I think he got 9%.
The fact that they're saying they're going to vote for him is big, because there are those who do not want to risk the outing in the cancel culture who are probably going to vote for him too. If 19% are willing to say it, it does make you wonder if there are not another 10% who just don't want to say it.
That's a fantastic insight, especially in that latest study that just came out that said there is a silent majority. There is a significant group, about 25%. They don't want to tell anyone their voting preference for Trump because they don't want to get into it. They don't like the terrible confrontations that they get into. No, I think you're right. This is pretty stunning. Certainly Terrell, and again, who was a liberal, he's not a wishful thinking conservative. He was a leftist for a number of years. He and Sean Hannity always got on, they were always arguing the opposite sides of the coin here. So I'm very hopeful. When you look at every poll among African Americans, they always want more police, not less. They want more funding, not less. They don't buy into this bizarre Marxist notion of, cancel culture now extended to the police, to defund and abolish. They're horrified by that. And they're seeing, again, they may not like Trump. They may not like Republicans, but they see him as the only one who's standing in between them and this left-wing hysteria. I've seen it too with urban populations, white urban populations. So you're seeing it as a middle upper class, where normally they would have left their urban environments, say like Brooklyn, New York, LA, and moved out to Texas, and then brought their blue politics with them. What we're finding now is they're moving out since COVID, since the insanity with the urban riots. They've moved out deliberately trying to protect themselves from these insane Democratic policies. So again, they're not necessarily fans of Trump or the Republicans, but they are voting now to defend themselves. So it's a defensive vote. And I think you're going to find them defecting over to the Republicans en masse as well.
For anybody who's concerned about this or not understanding what's happening, they had an interesting news graph yesterday of just dozens and dozens of moving vans in New York City, Manhattan, just a caravan of them, all loading people up and taking them out. Here's hoping what you said is exactly correct. For the first time, they don't move to Florida, they don't move to Georgia, they don't move to Idaho or Arizona and bring their voting patterns with them. If they're moving this quickly, if they're in the space of 6 months deciding they've had enough, here's hoping they will vote for policies that don't replicate what they had in the big progressive cities. Steve, we'll be back in just a moment on the side of the break. We'll continue this conversation. Back again for another interview with Steve Turley. Steve, we were beginning to ask the question about what's going on with the murder of our conservative patriot in Portland, and how everybody's trying to deflect this, right? They're blaming Trump for this. Trump's the reason that conservative is dead, which I find it really hard to believe, Steve, that there are many sober Democrats who aren't laughing out loud at that.
Absolutely. Everybody knows. I mean, Michael Goodwin of the New York Post who just had fun smacking the Democrats around with this. Nobody is buying this. Everybody knows that the mask mandates that were absolutely non-negotiable for business owners and those crazy right-wing nut patriots who are coming out, where you had healthcare workers in their scrubs and their masks standing in front of them like the Tiananmen Square person standing in front of a tank. Everyone saw those mask mandates magically disappear the moment you had this woke wave. And that's why we're never going to see another major shutdown again, I don't think. I mean, that's over. Nobody buys it anymore. So, and they know these were the this is the party that was not just simply sympathetic with the riots and the looting and so forth. They were actually cheerleaders for it, right? Chris Cuomo. So whoever said that protests were supposed to be peaceful, right? So no one's buying that. No one's buying it at all. And plus, we have studies that show, this is a Princeton study that came out in 2016, that race riots historically consistently make America more conservative. He looked at the race riots, particularly in the 1960s, and found that the Republican presidential candidate gained almost 10 points in 1968 than from the previous presidential election in 1964 in those counties that were closest and most proximate to the urban race riot. So I think Republicans know that, and I think Democrats are getting a sense of that. And so that's why the Republicans were able to pound the Democrats as purveyors of riots and insanity and chaos and mayhem, that they're the party of law and order. And Democrats know they're stuck with it. They know, as we saw, CNN sees the polls that they're not showing, interestingly enough. Their internal polls, Rush Limbaugh was talking about that. The internal polls all show that the Democrats are losing support in droves. That I love that image you gave, New York City, of people leaving in their caravans. I think in many ways that's what we're seeing too, to a certain extent, with sentiments towards the Democrats among independents. They may have been considering Joe Biden, but now after seeing all this, they've had it and they're going to go and vote for their incumbent.
Well, we had a CDC, Center for Disease Control spokesman actually come out a couple days ago and argue that no. That church is one thing where people infect themselves, they have to wear masks, they're just hotbeds of contagion. But these protests are fighting something more important than COVID. They're fighting systemic racism. So the so-called doctors at the CDC said, nope, got to keep churches shut down in the name of medicine and science. But in the name of sociology, we have to let the looters loot and the burners burn. And that, to me, shows you how much faith we should have in organizations like the CDC, which the left insists we must always believe. Transitioning real quick here. between the patriot who was murdered in Portland, with all the Portland activists celebrating that on TV cameras, and Ted Wheeler ignoring it, and then the situation with young Rittenhouse in Kenosha, a young man maybe a little bit overzealous, maybe a little bit with a comic book understanding of everything that was going on, but nevertheless showed up at the riots with a gun, trying to be helpful for those whose business were being raped and pillaged. He, as we know, got into an encounter, fired his gun, looking more and more like it was self-defense. Are these two situations, in your mind, a breakback point, a straw that broke the camel's back for the American people? We know that the approval ratings for Black Lives Matter have plummeted about a dozen points in the last couple of weeks. Would you say this is this going to be something that turns finally towards a Trump reelection, or is this just like everything else? It'll be out of the news cycle in 6 weeks, in a week or two, and we won't think about it anymore.
No, I think they have some permanence to them, because I think they're indicators of these just larger trajectories that don't go away every day. We're seeing escalation and like, we have to remember that Kyle would not have been there. No militia member would have marched into the city. No one would have had the McCloskeys would not have felt the need to break out their weapons if Democrat mayors allowed the police to do their jobs. But we all know that Democratic mayors ordered the police to stand down and let the people riot and loot, and then tried to sanctify that decision by precisely what the CDC person was spewing out, this nonsense. Again, that's so unintelligible to mid-America. You know, when they talk that way, it doesn't make any sense. They don't think in those terms. Those are very urbanite, globalist terms that don't resonate with the vast majority of the regional populations of our country. This notion that we need to fight racism, but again, in Christian terms, in mid-America terms, not fight the demonic forces that give us racism in the first place, or no, we need to shut you down so as to protect you from this virus, but no, you don't want to fight the demonic forces through prayer and sacrament that are giving you the virus in the first place. It's absurd. It's a thoroughly secular conception of the world that has no intelligibility to mid-America, none whatsoever.
Well, they keep arguing that Donald Trump, this is the new talking point. They for about 4 months, they ignored the violent riots, called them protests, right? There's no violence. This is all made up. And then all of a sudden, it almost had Don Lemon, for the first time in his life, got a light bulb above that empty head of his on CNN and decided, oh no, now we have to talk about this because the polls are going the wrong way. And suddenly the Democrats discovered violence, but they're blaming it on Trump. I mean, it is incomprehensible to me that that Donald Trump is fostering this kind. So Donald Trump is a secret agent acting on behalf of Antifa. It just strains credulity, doesn't it?
It does, and again, it reminds me, just the other day, right? We had that chyron underneath one of the segments where they were covering in Wisconsin all the disasters and the fires behind him, and the chyron said, "Fiery but mostly peaceful protests." So you just had to laugh there. Yes, we've got arsonists here, but they're mostly peaceful. They're peaceful arsonists. No, they finally are admitting these are riots because they know nobody bought this silliness, the whole peaceful protester thing. But when all is said and done, and of course then they're pivoting to try to blame it on Trump. But when all is said and done, they performed something for all the nation to see. Democrat after Democrat after Democrat intentionally abdicated their law enforcement responsibilities. People saw that. They made the decision to intentionally abdicate their law enforcement responsibilities. That's why militias started marching in to the cities, in order to protect elderly people in these urban neighborhoods that are the primary victims of this chaos and mayhem. And so we would never have had a Kyle Rittenhouse situation. We would never have had a Jay Bishop situation. We'd not have any of this if Democrat mayors and governors simply implemented and fulfilled their law-keeping responsibilities. They deliberately abdicated them. There is no spinning their way out of that one.
And it's the magnitude of this. Like you said, there's nothing subtle about that. Middle America is not subtle, right? Like you said, we're not college students listening to a lecture on women's studies where everything is so thinly shaved with jargon. This is, on the one hand, you're persecuting. The California just took away the parking premises of the church that tried to stay open. They killed their parking. I mean, they're going after middle and lower class Americans with everything in their disposal to shut them down, while they're literally allowing murder and arson and riots in the street. You could not have a broader. It's almost tailor-made if you're a Republican sitting back and watching this.
Absolutely, and people see it. They see this asymmetry. They know it's a complete myopic, unequal distribution of justice. And they have no intention of participating in it at all.
Dr. Steve, where can people find all the information and all your programming?
They can go to my website. It's turleytalks.com. It's my last name, T as in Tom, U-R-L-E-Y, talks.com, or just punch in Dr. Steve Turley on YouTube.
And you're over 100,000 viewers now.
500,000.
500,000. Dr. Steve Turley, all the success in the world. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much, dude.